Okay, in this one, going to be doing chapters 10 through 12. At this point, it's been like a real long time since I read the book. I'm just going off notes now, so it might be kind of sparse. But these are the last couple chapters, I believe, before it gets really into like specifically JQ stuff and like actual ethnic Jewish people and religious Jewish people. And that's where I want to spend more time analyzing it, because that's kind of the point of this channel. But anyway, chapter 10 starts off in England and the Reformation that occurred there. He describes it as being more capitalistic revolution than the Munster and Anabaptist revolutions in the continent that were more communistic in leaning. Obviously using kind of like idiosyncratic modern terms to describe these things. But anyway, proto-communist, proto-capitalist, whatever, drawing upon the kind of Protestant work ethic deriving from Calvinism. And this chapter is kind of another example of a chapter where Jews really aren't directly talked about, at least ethnic religious ones, because as we know that in 1290 England kicked out its Jews. Now Jones makes the claim that only the principal Jews left, which were a minority, and the rest just stayed on and like pretended to convert to Christianity. And he also makes a statement that the Lombards, who were like this Italian merchant group, were just crypto Jews in England at least. He doesn't give any sources or footnotes for this, so I can't really like see what he's looking at, but I've just never heard of these kind of claims, and I can't really grapple with them. So, I don't know, I'm pretty skeptical of that, but moving on, it doesn't really matter either way. And once again, Jones claims that the whole Protestant notions of the Bible and translating it into the vernacular, like William Tyndale's translation, just led to like a Judaizing kind of force. Even to go as far as to say Puritans basically discarded Christian morality and replaced it with Jewish morality, speaking of Oliver Cromwell and his dictatorship over England. But before going there, he's discussing, of course, King Henry VIII, who broke off from the Catholic Church, and his successor, Edward VI, and how this led to kind of looting of the church lands and church property into private hands of certain families and not just like generic church property, which I guess one could say is closer to like private property capitalism than the more feudalistic kind of thing going on previously, at least if you want to put it in Marxist terms. But this policy is at least attempted to be reversed under Queen Mary, otherwise known as Bloody Mary, who went on to persecute Protestants. There was obviously a back and forth. Catholics persecuted Protestants, Protestants persecuted Catholics. I do think it's kind of funny how Jones treats this all in an almost secular kind of manner. Like, he never really actually grapples with like substantive arguments over like Catholic and Protestant divides over doctrine and stuff. He just makes it all about like money and power and politics. It's kind of funny. He refers to Anne Boleyn as a Lutheran sex agent for King Henry VIII, and kind of just dismisses the burning alive of Protestant heretics in his view by Mary. But at this time, I guess one could say that like politics and religion were just so intertwined that persecution for politics could be easily described as a persecution for religious views as well. So I don't know, just the more I cover this book, I just don't understand how Protestants can really be cool with this guy, but whatever. And that's more or less just setting the scene for what's taking place in England. He then, in the next like 10 pages or so, talks about John Dee for a little bit, but then goes on to give an overview of the situation in Amsterdam, which kind of became like an intellectual Calvinist hub for trade and industry, and where a lot of printing was done for Protestant propaganda and Bibles. He talks about how a lot of like disaffected Catholics, conversos, Jews, Protestants, whatever, like all went to Amsterdam, Antwerp, Amsterdam, whatever. Those two cities were the main hubs for a lot of printing and industry and just like trade and information collection, stuff like that. So essentially he's basically saying that Protestants and Jews like kind of teamed up with each other against the Catholic Church. And Jones even talked about how Luther and Calvin were directly accused of being either Jews or like working for the Jews. But at least Jones, and not really valuing the whole race and racialist type arguments, does admit that the Judaizing tendencies in movements like Unitarianism, Puritanism, and individuals like Michael Servetus do not rely on any kind of Jewish descent or blood. It's just like an ideas kind of thing, which is fair game. And I do think a lot of Protestants actually would say that Catholicism is more of like a Greek pagan distortion of true Christianity, and true Christianity really does have like Jewish roots. I mean, obviously both believe in the Old Testament. I just think it's like an interesting, his bias just like clearly shows throughout the whole book, but you know, he's a traditional Catholic, so that's fine. And returning to England, he talks about the coronation of Queen Elizabeth and goes back to John Dee, talking about how he went abroad to learn Hebrew and study the Kabbalah, medieval Jewish mysticism, gematria, stuff like that. And he talks about that for a while. I'm not gonna get into it because it's like super convoluted, but eventually Dee goes back to England and is like an advisor advisor to Queen Elizabeth. And during this time, the Council of Trent happens, and there's just like a lot of Catholic, Protestant, I guess you could say rivalry, and Catholics are trying to get back into England, and Protestants are trying to obviously like weaken the power of the church, the Catholic Church that is. And Jones brings up Jewish conversos like Marco Perez, who was like a Calvinist leader of Jewish ancestry who fought against the Catholic Church, brings up the iconoclast riots that happened in the Netherlands. Honestly, just like way too much history to go over in a quick review, but same basic theme of like Jews and Protestants supposedly working together against the Catholics. Again, like I don't know how much of this is like conjecture. Sometimes Jones will just say someone has like Jewish ancestry, and it's kind of hard to tell sometimes, and whether or not that person is doing something just because they might have some Jewish ancestry, or they actually are just convicted and convinced of Protestant ideas. Like, I don't know. But the kind of main thing I guess Jones is getting from John Dee is that John Dee helped to convince Queen Elizabeth to start her own kind of English empire that rivaled the Spanish Empire. And while the Spanish Empire would be like this Catholic force, the English would be a Protestant, Judaizing force in his view to rival the Spanish Empire. And in Jones' opinion, the Spanish Empire is more of like a benevolent empire, while the English Empire is just kind of like robbing force, I guess. I don't really know why he like makes this moral claim that the Spanish were somehow like superior, but that's his view. And just goes on to talk about how Dee worked his like Kabbalistic magic to summon angels or demons and was a spy for the English. It's just all very like dense material to work with. I'm going over like real broad strokes. He brings up Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe plays and how they kind of reflect the times with like witchcraft and stuff like that, the kind of stuff that Dee was supposedly engaged in. And all honesty, like reading through this chapter, it's just like so long and dense, like you kind of just like forget what the point of the whole book is. I don't know, it's just very, I feel like a lot of people just like haven't read this whole book. It's like very long and extensive and just goes on like crazy tangents. It's really hard to keep up with at times, but really interesting nonetheless. But yeah, I think I'm just gonna end that chapter because there's just like so much to get into. But just kind of leaves off with the death of Queen Elizabeth, the death of Dee, and how Amsterdam kind of becomes like the new hub of Jewish life in Europe. Chapter 11 picks up on this Amsterdam being kind of like a safe haven for Jews note. He brings up the Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel and Isaac of Rocamora, both Jews from Marano families who converted and then kind of like reconverted to Judaism. And many former Jewish people would go to Amsterdam to kind of like get reinitiated, you know, circumcised if they weren't circumcised, whatever. It was basically like legal to be a Jew there essentially, and even some people would go there who didn't have Jewish ancestry to convert. And even if there was no conversion, there was just a lot of focus on like the Old Testament, Judaizing, stuff like that. And once again, the kind of like millennialist end times prophecy from the book of Daniel idea becomes prominent among these people. And back in England, the Puritans believed that if the Jews were let back into England, it would usher in the end times. Jones makes the remark that sola scriptura in a sense kind of lends itself to Judaizing in this like focus on the end times because it's not kind of rooted in Catholic interpretation and kind of like the years of church history. I'm not explaining it that well, but essentially the church like was able to interpret the Bible rather than just people and their own passions interpreting the Bible. Jones also makes the remark that a lot of this revolutionary hotbed activity was only possible in the Dutch lowlands because of like the economic prosperity there that kind of let themselves think they could take on like the more powerful large Spanish Empire, and kind of looking at Old Testament text and in terms of like how Israel was like a small nation against larger empires, stuff like that, in order to boost their, I guess, confidence against the what they saw as like the Catholic domination over Europe. And basically all the different Protestant groups and revolutionaries converged in the Netherlands, and so that just created a hotbed of activity. And not only that, but the discovery of the New World and like the, you know, new peoples of the New World led to a belief that the Lost 10 tribes were in America, so that just also lent credence in their view to the idea that the world was going to end. At the same time, over in England, Oliver Cromwell is engaged in a civil war with the Anglican rulers, him being a Puritan and essentially thinking that the Anglicans were still too like Roman and not, you know, shedding off all the papist kind of accessories of Christianity. And many Puritans thought the end of the world was gonna come to be as well, and thought the conversion of the Jews was imminent. So kind of like a back and forth of like them being Judaizers, but also thought Jews would convert to Christianity, because the New Testament says at the end of times the Jews are going to convert. And Jones further spells out why sola scriptura kind of leads to Judaizing, because in his words, it democratizes the Bible and kind of, instead of prioritizing the New Testament, makes the New Testament just the lens to see the Old Testament through. And because there are more Old Testament books, that just leads to more of an emphasis on those books. I mean, there's just a lot more information in the Old Testament than the New. A lot more things to read and gain information from and teaching. But anyways, Oliver Cromwell decides to let the Jews back into England because he thinks it'll usher in the end times. And as Cromwell consolidates power in England, Jones takes his view to Poland, where the Jewish history has a pretty unique story, I guess, where also a lot of Jews were at the time and had a unique relationship with the government. A lot of Jews from Central Europe immigrated to Poland if they weren't going to Amsterdam, and essentially the population of Polish Jews just grew wildly disproportionately over the Christian population, and a lot of them were working with or under the landlords and leaders of Poland, and a like kind of separate system known as the Kahal and the Arenda system emerged in order to kind of like have a division of power and a separation of power among the Jews and the Polish leaders. They kind of like worked hand in hand. Essentially, the classic rulers and princes or whatever used Jews to like for tax purposes and like do business essentially. But eventually the situation in Poland, like in other countries, kind of fell apart and violence erupted with the Chemelki, I think that's how you pronounce it, pogroms, where 100,000 Jews died. Jones said that a lot of Jews were like practicing usury, all the normal stuff, and the Cossacks got mad at that and decided to kill them all. Kind of like the usual thing that's been recounted in this book so far. But all this to say that the Jews who did end up escaping Poland linked up with their co-religionists and just kind of added to the whole messianic fervor, because they believed that pogrom just was like the start of the Messianic age, more or less. And meanwhile, Cromwell, in his execution of the English king and genocide of the Irish, used like Old Testament imagery and quotes to justify these acts. And once again, in looking at another geographic location around this time, Jones takes his attention to Sabtai Tzvi, who was a self-proclaimed Jewish messiah in Turkey. And while Tzvi was from a wealthy merchant family, in his studies of the Talmud and all the historical goings-ons at the time, kind of revved up the messianic fervor, and in his own worldview and study came to believe that he was the Messiah, that the end times were upon, the Jews and whatnot, and that he believed that kind of like an inversion of Torah commandments, so like no longer was like strict sexual morality in terms of like monogamy imposed. It was kind of like a free love type of thing, basically just like an inversion of a lot of like the basic commandments of the Bible. And going back to Manasseh ben Israel, he makes a couple expeditions to England and has talks with Oliver Cromwell to try and like bring the Jews back to England, like to repeal the previous decree. And this does eventually happen, but not in like any really robust way. It's more just the old law kind of just dissipates. There's not like some grand decree and like a bunch of Jews go to England or anything like that. Both Cromwell and Manasseh ben Israel die, and it's just not like there's any like grand finale to Jews going back to England or anything, but there's essentially no law in the books that says they can't return. Again, I'm just going over broad strokes here. It's like a lot. And going back to Sabtai Tzvi, he just gets married a bunch of times, has like a bunch of like weird cult followers, like uses sex to manipulate people. Jones claims that Tzvi is kind of like a precursor to the sexual theories, I guess you'd say, of Freud and Jung. I don't know how true that is. I haven't studied that, and eventually he's just getting more and more followers. He meets up with this guy named Nathan of Gaza. To make a long story short, he gets put in jail and is forced to convert to Islam because the Sultan, Ottoman Sultan, views him as a threat, and like he just doesn't want all this messianic fervor. They don't want to kill him because they think that would cause like too much panic and hysteria, so they just make him convert to Islam. And this news caused a lot of dread among the Jewish community who followed him, and some chose to like convert to Islam along with him, but kind of like in secret. I think that's where you hear the term like the Donma Jews, and some people say Mustafa Ataturk was like a Donma Jew or whatever. But essentially the rise and fall of all this messianic fervor and how like nothing really came out of all this led to, at least in the case of Jews to either follow like the rational Spinoza path, which like rejected traditional views of religion, or to just shelter more inwardly and go into like a more mystical, inward looking path of the Hasidics. At least that's what Jones says. Like those two paths kind of emerge from this overall messianic fervor and ultimate failure. And that's basically where he ends that chapter, so we can move on to the next one, which covers Freemasonry. Jones starts off talking about how Francis Bacon, the famous English scientist, took influence from John Dee and apparently like wrote on Kabbalistic, esoteric topics, taking influence from the Rosicrucians, who were like another secret society, and essentially founded Freemasonry, at least in England. And that Freemasonry was kind of a way for intellectuals to move beyond just the normal religious sects that were abounding in Europe at the time, and because there was so much religious strife, it was seen as like a nice alternative to like Protestantism or Catholicism or what have you. Looking at The New Atlantis, which was a work written by Bacon, posthumously released, it points to like Kabbalistic ideas and stuff surrounding Solomon's Temple, which the Freemasons like co-opt somewhat. It's basically just Jones saying that Bacon knew about these ideas and put them in his writings and his ideas to form Freemasonry. And he also suggests that Bacon's book leads to the invention of the idea of the whole British Israelism, which certain like white nationalist British identity groups believe that they're the real Jews and the real Israelites. I'm not sure like how far I go with Jones on this. I haven't read this book, and I think he even says in his work that the New Atlantis is very allegorical, so I don't know, like, whatever, that's just what Jones is saying. But anyways, he discusses the beginning of the 30 Years' War, which apparently kind of clamps down and pushes underground a lot of this, like, occultic science. And one of the participants in at least one of the battles of the 30 Years' War was Rene Descartes, who Jones says became, like, the leading European philosopher and kind of paved the way. Not only did he replace so-called Jewish science of, like, gematria and numerology with mathematics, but also he paved the way to idealism and materialism. So thinkers like Spinoza up to the French Revolution and Marx, and on the other hand, people like Hegel. I'm not going to pretend like I know anything about philosophy, but I'm just saying what Jones is saying. Jones says that Bacon's science is really just Jewish science that grew out of Kabbalah, and that it's essentially Whig history to kind of turn it into this like rationalistic worldview, and that's like not the case in Jones' perspective, and that both Baconian science, if that's how you would say that, and Newtonian science were essentially just anti-Catholic and pro-English sciences to like bolster the English Empire. Almost kind of sounds like a modern like CRT scholar talking about like white European science in general or something, but I don't know enough about the topic to really like get what he's getting at. It was just too convoluted for me to really understand. And apparently at this time, not only were the English kind of working with the Jews, but also the Scots, who were also into Freemasonry under the Stuarts, and they, I guess, wanted Jews to finance them to get back into power, especially after Cromwell's attempt to bring the Jews back in kind of failed, which I talked about earlier. The book goes a little bit back and forth with timelines and stuff. It's fine. But once Charles II takes the throne after Cromwell, he favors the Jewish merchants in London and allows them to stay. So I guess during this time is when Jews are essentially like more or less allowed back into England in a permanent fashion. And according to Jones, because the king was brought back through a combo of Jewish and Freemasonic influence, the Royal Society becomes the exoteric branch, I guess you'd say, of going back to John Dee's Christian Kabbalism and Freemasonry, the esoteric component in England, all being served or used to serve the English Empire. But ultimately, according to Jones, the Royal Society delved too much into like Jewish science and just like really couldn't progress until Newton and his magnum opus came out in the late 17th century, which put science and math on a physical basis and diverted away from Dee's Kabbalism. However, Newtonian science was still used and I guess propagated to undermine Catholic states, at least in Jones's view, and was basically expounding an English universe in which God was like a constitutional monarch, gravity replaced magic, and even went further beyond science into the realms of like politics and economics, and established kind of like a laissez-faire attitude in these realms. I guess what Jones is basically saying is that this kind of thinking led to what we would call liberalism, and that the Glorious Revolution came out of this type of thinking 1 year later after the publication by Newton. And that generally Newtonian science, which one could say expelled angels and even God from the universe, was used as like a revolutionary tool in the continent. And furthermore, that the roots of the Enlightenment began at this time under the Knights of Jubilation, who published a lot of works and books that would be influential in the European Enlightenment. And not only was kind of like a rationalistic mode of thinking applied to universe and the physical laws, but just religion and history to like, revered religious figures. I guess this is where you could say like real like biblical criticism may have started. Biblical criticism in the sense that they didn't see the text as divine, but actually like looking at the history of it, at least in a crude form, that is. And once again saying that if you didn't need a god or religion to like run people's lives or run the universe, whatever. You didn't need a king to run a country. So it was just, and all of this was inherently revolutionary. And it became even more anti-Catholic when the Pope explicitly condemned any Catholic to join the group. That's probably why you see like a lot of anti-Freemasonry stuff from Catholicism and vice versa. Like the founding fathers some of them were pretty anti-Catholic and were also Freemasons. But anyway, a lot of like, essentially Freemasonry became a thing for like free-thinking people, like liberal Protestants, Jews, etc. Jones discusses how Voltaire used a lot of these ideals to attack the Catholic Church in France. He discusses how the Masonic lodges basically allowed people to have like any kind of ideology they wanted as long as they followed certain principles, and these principles were basically just the Noahide laws, which if you don't know are like the 7 laws of Noah that in Orthodox Judaism is basically just like certain ethical codes to live by. He discusses the ideas of Rousseau and Montesquieu and how those influence American politics and the American Revolution, obviously later on the French Revolution, and describes the American mind as a confluence of contradictory forms of Judaizing, Puritanism, and Freemasonry. And this lines pretty well with the Catholic, organized church view of America as well. I believe they like issued an encyclical against Americanism as such. Like they basically thought the American liberal Enlightenment values in the government form was heretical form of government, more or less. Jones then talks about the French Revolution itself and how a French priest named Baruel wrote a book about the French Revolution, how it came to be, which like used both Freemasonry and the Illuminati to kind of explain the origins of it. But apparently there was controversy over how much, rather a lack of emphasis on the role of Freemasonry in the revolution from his work. For whatever reason, Baruel didn't want to blame the English Freemasons for the revolution. But essentially what Jones is trying to say is like at the root of all these things is just like Talmudic Judaism is kind of like the center of all this like Freemasonry, Illuminati stuff. Essentially it's just like Antichrist. I know there's been a lot like written about the Freemasons, Illuminati. These are like really like kind of secretive organizations, so I take everything with a grain of salt, but certainly they were created to, in a sense, like circumvent the church and kind of allow for more like free-thinking types of ideologies, which would certainly like threaten the authority of the church and divine right of kings, stuff like that. But moving on to Napoleon, who was seen as kind of a liberator of the Jews, and his military campaigns were seen as kind of like a messianic precursor, or like he was the Messiah. One example being Jacob Frank, whose followers were known as Frankists, and he was seen as kind of a successor to Sabtai Tzvi. Napoleon convenes an assembly of Jews, which he calls the Sanhedrin, harkening back to like Old Testament and Temple times, and was basically a way to like gauge whether the Jews could be French citizens or they'd remain kind of this other in the society, because for most of medieval European history, the Jews were just in ghettos and not really like equal footing as citizens, but Napoleon wanted to see if the Jews could be equal citizens in this new republic, and also wanted like the Jews of Eastern Europe to help him in his invasion of Russia. But all this to say that basically it just created more messianic religious fervor among Jews, more revolutionary activity, and ultimately, obviously, Napoleon gets exiled and defeated, and there's kind of a reaction to the Revolution, Enlightenment, Napoleon, stuff like that in France, but it just, in Jones's view, all this just paves the way for more like modern revolutionary activity, like German Jewish reform movements, Marxism, etc., etc. So that's that chapter, and I do want to real quick just look at some other source material that talks a little bit about these issues, specifically surrounding the French Revolution. At this time, the majority of Jews in France were from the Alsace-Lorraine region, and they were still at this time like basically just ghettoized religious Jews, not like the Jews in Paris who are more secular and liberal, but these Jews were still like clinging to the old ways and like religiosity. And people like Voltaire and the later French revolutionaries weren't exactly like pro-Semitic, and even had like some anti-Semitic tendencies, just not necessarily based on like traditional Christianity, but still kind of had the vestiges of that. And with the same old stuff that like Jews were either like moneylenders or just like didn't have like the kind of like the same view of liberté, égalité, fraternité kind of thinking. Like they just weren't thinking like that because they were like shtetl Jews. Like that wasn't their thing. So a lot of revolutionaries didn't like Jews, and after the storming of the Bastille, there was actually a lot of complaints from the Jewish community to the National Assembly, basically saying that this is like kind of worse than what was even going on before. And whereas Napoleon did set up this Sanhedrin, a lot of Jews thought it was like improper to do so, kind of for the same reasons that a lot of Jews later on thought it was improper to establish a Jewish state. They just thought only God could do all this kind of stuff. But even at the Sanhedrin meeting that Napoleon composed, he was like basically calling all the shots and just telling Jews to like kind of get in line with the Republican ideals of the revolution. And just generally, like a lot of Jews, even Jones talks about this a little bit, but like a lot of Jews in North Africa during Napoleon's expeditions, and the Jews in the Pale Settlement, they just didn't really respond to Napoleon's not request, but Napoleon's kind of rallying cry for Jews to join him in like some kind of messianic fervor to like go back to Jerusalem, because it was just all under the guise of not like atheism, but just not Judaism, like not religiosity. So yeah, I just wanted to add that really quick from the book Scapegoat of Revolution, because it somewhat coincides with what Jones is talking about. And like at the end of the day, the majority of Jews at this time were like totally out of the loop when it came to these kind of ideals and ideas. Like they were just like a bunch of ghetto Orthodox Jews essentially. But I think that'll do it for now, and the later chapters I should be going more in depth on, but just want to get a review of that one or those because I want to do it chronologically. So thanks, leave a like, subscribe, and peace out.